diffusion physics dominating.
But once again, with the electrodes, the biophysics that you need to understand is not as deep, because no matter where you're placing it, you're listening to a small crowd of local neurons.
Correct. Yeah. So once you penetrate the brain, you're in the arena, so to speak.
And there's a lot of neurons.
There are many, many of them.
But then again, there's there's a whole field of neuroscience that's studying like how the different groupings, the different sections of the seating in the arena, what they usually are responsible for, which is where the metaphor probably falls apart, because the seating is not that organized in an arena.
Also, most of them are silent. They don't really do much, or their activities are, you have to hit it with just the right set of stimulus.
So they're usually quiet.
They're usually very quiet. Quiet. There's, similar to dark energy and dark matter, there's dark neurons. What are they all doing? When you place these electrode, again, like within this 100 micron volume, you have 40 or so neurons. Like, why do you not see 40 neurons? Why do you see only a handful? What is happening there?
Well, they're mostly quiet, but like when they speak, they say profound shit, I think. That's the way I'd like to think about it. Anyway, before we zoom in even more, let's zoom out. So how does Neuralink work? From the surgery to the implant to the signal and the decoding process, and the human being able to use the implant to actually affect the world outside. And all of this, I'm asking in the context of there's a gigantic historic milestone that Neuralink just accomplished in January of this year, putting a Neuralink implant in the first human being, Noland. And there's been a lot to talk about there about his experience, because he's able to describe all the nuance and the beauty and the fascinating complexity of that experience, of everything involved. But on the technical level, how does Neuralink work?
Yeah, so there are three major components to the technology that we're building. One is the device, the thing that's actually recording these neural chatters. We call it N1 implant, or the link. And we have a surgical robot that's actually doing an implantation of these tiny, tiny wires that we call threads that are smaller than human hair. And once everything is surgerized, you have these neural signals, these spiking neurons that are coming out of the brain. And you need to have some sort of software to decode what the users intend to do with that. So there's what's called the Neuralink application, or B1 app, that's doing that translation. It's running the very, very simple machine learning model that decodes these inputs that are neural signals, and then convert it to a set of outputs that allows our participant, first participant Nolan, to be able to control a cursor on the screen.
And this is done wirelessly.
So we our implant is actually two-part. The link has these flexible tiny wires called threads that have multiple electrodes along its length, and they're only inserted into the cortical layer, which is about 3 to 5 millimeters in a human brain, in the motor cortex region. That's where the kind of the intention for movement lies in. And we have 64 of these threads, each thread having 16 electrodes along, the span of 3 to 4 millimeters, separated by 200 microns. So you can actually record along the depth of the insertion. And based on that signal, there's custom, integrated circuit, or ASIC, that we built that amplifies the neural signals that you're recording, and then digitizing it, and then has some mechanism for detecting whether there was an interesting event, that is a spiking event, and decide to send that or not send that through Bluetooth to an external device, whether it's a phone or a computer that's running this Neuralink application.
So there's onboard signal processing already just to decide whether this is an interesting event or not. So there is some computational power on board in addition to the human brain.
Yeah, so it does the signal processing to kind of really compress the amount of signal that you're recording. So we have a total of 1,000 electrodes, sampling at just under 20 kilohertz with 10 bit each. So That's 200 megabits. That's coming through to the chip from 1,000 channel simultaneous neural recording, and that's quite a bit of data. And there are technology available to send that off wirelessly, but being able to do that in a very, very thermally constrained environment that is a brain. So there has to be some amount of compression that happens to send off only the interesting data that you need, which in this particular case for motor decoding is occurrence of a spike or not, and then being able to use that to decode the intended cursor movement. So the implant itself processes it, figures out whether a spike happened or not with our spike detection algorithm, and then sends it off, packages it, send it off through Bluetooth to an external device that then has the model to decode, okay, based on these spiking inputs, did Nolan wish to go up, down, left, right, or click, or right click, or whatever?
All of this is really fascinating, but let's stick on the N1 implant itself. So the thing that's in the brain. So I'm looking at a picture of it. There's an enclosure. There's a charging coil. So we didn't talk about the charging, which is fascinating. The battery, the power electronics, the antenna. Then there's the signal processing electronics. I wonder if there's more kinds of signal processing you can do. That's another question. And then there's the threads themselves with the enclosure on the bottom. So maybe to ask about the charging. So there's an external charging device.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's an external charging device. So yeah, the second part of the implant, the threads are the ones, again, just the last 3 to 5 millimeters are the ones that are actually penetrating the cortex. Yeah. Rest of it is, actually most of the volume is occupied by the battery, rechargeable battery. And it's about the size of a quarter. I actually have a device here if you want to take a look at it. This is the flexible thread component of it, and then this is the implant. So it's about the size of a US quarter. It's about 9 millimeter thick. So basically, this implant, once you have the craniectomy and the thoracotomy, threads are inserted, and the hole that you created, this craniectomy, gets replaced with that. So basically, that thing plugs that hole, and you can screw in these self-drilling cranial screws to hold it in place. And at the end of the day, once you have the skin flap over, there's only about 2 to 3 millimeters that's obviously transitioning off of the top of the implant to where the screws are, and that's the minor bump that you have.
Those threads look tiny. That's incredible. That is really incredible. That is really incredible. And also, as you're right, most of the actual volume is the battery.
Yeah.
Wow, this is way smaller than I realized.
They are also, the threads themselves are quite strong.
They look strong.
And the thread themselves also has a very interesting feature at the end of it called the loop. And that's the mechanism to which the robot is able to interface and manipulate this tiny hair-like structure.
And they're tiny. So what's the width of a thread?
Yeah, so the width of a thread starts from 16 micron and then tapers out to about 84 micron. So, average human hair is about 80 to 100 micron in width.
This thing is amazing. This thing is amazing.
Yes, most of the volume is occupied by the battery, rechargeable lithium-ion cell, and the charging is done through inductive charging, which is actually very commonly used. Your cell phone, most cell phones have that. The biggest difference is that for us, usually when you have a phone and you want to charge it on a charging pad, you don't really care how hot it gets. Whereas for us, it matters. There's a very strict regulation and good reasons to not actually increase the surrounding tissue temperature by 2 degrees Celsius. So there's actually a lot of innovation that is packed into this to allow charging of this implant without causing that temperature threshold to reach. And even small things like you see this charging coil and what's called a ferrite shield, right? So without that ferrite shield, what you end up having when you have resonant inductive charging is that the battery itself is a metallic can, and you form these eddy currents from external charger, and that causes heating, and that actually contributes to inefficiency in charging. So this ferrite shield, what it does is that it actually concentrate that field line away from the battery and then around the coil that's actually wrapped around it.
There's a lot of really fascinating design here to make it. I mean, you're integrating a computer into a complex biological system.
Yeah, there's a lot of innovation here. I would say that part of what enabled this was just the innovations in the wearable. There's a lot of really, really powerful, tiny, low power microcontrollers, temperature sensors, or various different sensors, and power electronics. A lot of innovation really came in the charging coil design, how this is packaged, and how do you enable charging such that you don't really exceed that temperature limit, which is not a constraint for other devices out there.
So let's talk about the threads themselves, those tiny, tiny, tiny things. So how many of them are there? You mentioned 1,000 electrodes. How many threads are there? And what do the electrodes have to do with the threads?
Yeah, so the current instantiation of the device has 64 threads, and each thread has 16 electrodes for a total of 1,024 electrodes that are capable of both recording and stimulating. The thread is basically this polymer insulated wire. The metal conductor is the kind of a tiramisu cake of gold plat tie. And they're very, very tiny wires, 2 micron in width, so 2/1 millionth of meter.
It's crazy that thing I'm looking at has the polymer insulation, has the conducting material, and has 16 electrodes at the end of it.
On each of those threads.
Yeah, on each of those threads.
Correct.
16. Each one of those.
Yes, you're not going to be able to see it with naked eyes.
And I mean, to state the obvious, or maybe for people who are just listening, they're flexible.
Yes. That's also one element that was incredibly important for us. So each of these threads are, as I mentioned, 16 micron in width, and then they taper to 84 micron, but in thickness, they're less than 5 micron. Mm-hmm. And in thickness is mostly, polyimide at the bottom and this metal track, and then another polyimide. So 2 micron of polyimide, 400 nanometer of this metal stack, and 2 micron of polyimide sandwiched together to protect it from the environment that is 37 degrees C bag of salt water.
So maybe can you speak to some interesting aspects of the material design here? Like, what does it take to design a thing like this and to be able to manufacture a thing like this for people who don't know anything about this kind of thing?
Yeah, so the material selection that we have is not, I don't think it was particularly unique. There were other labs, and there are other labs that are kind of looking at similar material stack. There's kind of a fundamental question and still needs to be answered around the longevity and reliability of these microelectrodes that we call, compared to some of the other more conventional neural interfaces devices that are intracranial, so penetrating the cortex, that are more rigid, like the Utah array, that are these 4x4 millimeter kind of silicon shank that have exposed recording site at the end of it. That's been kind of the innovation from Richard Norman back in 1997. It's called the Utah array because he was at University of Utah.
And what does the Utah array look like? So it's a rigid type of
so we can actually look it up. Yeah. Yeah, so it's a bed of needle. There's
Okay, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Those are rigid shank.
Rigid. Yeah, you weren't kidding.
And the size and the number of shanks vary anywhere from 64 to 128. At the very tip of it is an exposed electrode that actually records neural signal. The other thing that's interesting to note is that unlike Neuralink threads that have recording electrodes that are actually exposed iridium oxide recording sites along the depth, this is only at a single depth. So these Utah array spokes can be anywhere between 0.5 millimeters to 1.5 millimeter. And they also have designs that are slanted, so you can have it inserted at different depth. But that's one of the other big differences. And then, the main key difference is the fact that there's no active electronics. These are just electrodes. And then there's a bundle of a wire that you're seeing. And then that actually then exits the craniectomy, that then has this port that you can connect to for any external electronic devices. They are working on or have the wireless telemetry device, but it still requires a through the skin port that actually is one of the biggest failure modes for infection for the system.
What are some of the challenges associated with flexible threads? Like, for example, on the robotics side, R1, implanting those threads. How difficult is that task?
Yeah. So as you mentioned, they're very, very difficult to maneuver by hand. These Utah arrays that you saw earlier, they're actually inserted by a neurosurgeon actually positioning it near the site that they want, and then there's a pneumatic hammer that actually pushes them in. So it's a pretty simple process, and they're easy to maneuver. But for these thin film arrays, they're very, very tiny and flexible, so they're very difficult to maneuver. So that's why we built an entire robot to do that. There are other reasons for why we built the robot, and that is ultimately we want this to help millions and millions of people that can benefit from this, and there just aren't that many neurosurgeons out there. Robots can be something that we hope can actually do large parts of the surgery. But the robot is this entire other sort of category of product that we're working on, and it's essentially this multi-axis gantry system that has the specialized robot head that has all of the optics and this kind of a needle retracting mechanism that maneuvers these threads via this loop structure that you have on the thread.
So the thread already has a loop structure by which you can grab it.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
So this is fascinating. So you mentioned optics. So there's a robot, R1. So for now, there's a human that actually creates a hole in the skull. And then after that, there's a computer vision component that's finding a way to avoid the blood vessels. And then you're grabbing it by the loop, each individual thread, and placing it in a particular location to avoid the blood vessels. And also choosing the depth of placement, all that kind of stuff. So controlling the 3D geometry of the placement.
Correct. So the aspect of this robot that is unique is that it's not surgeon assisted or human assisted. It's a semi-automatic or automatic robot. Once obviously there are human component to it when you're placing targets. You can always move it away from kind of major vessels that you see. But we want to get to a point where one click and it just does the surgery within minutes.
So the computer vision component finds great targets, candidates, and the human kind of approves them. And the robot does it do like one thread at a time, or does it do
it does one thread at a time? And that's actually also one thing that we are looking at ways to do multiple threads at a time. There's nothing stopping from it. You can have multiple kind of engagement mechanisms. But right now it's one by one. And, we also still do quite a bit of just kind of verification to make sure that it got inserted. If so, how deep, did it actually match what was programmed in, and, so on and so forth.
And the actual electrodes are placed at differing depths in the, it's very small differences, but differences.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so that there's some reasoning behind that, as you mentioned, like it gets more varied signal.
Yeah, we try to place them all around 3 or 4 millimeter from the surface, just because the span of the electrode, those 16 electrodes that we currently have in this version, spans roughly around 3 millimeters. So we want to get all of those in the brain.
This is fascinating. Okay, so there's a million questions here. If we go zoom in specifically on the electrodes, so what is your sense? How many neurons is each individual electrode listening to?
Yeah, each electrode can record from anywhere between 0 to 40, as I mentioned, right, earlier. But practically speaking, we only see about, at most, like 2 to 3. And you can actually distinguish which neuron it's coming from by the shape of the spikes.
Oh, cool.
So I mentioned the spike detection algorithm that we have. It's called BOSS algorithm, Buffer Online Spike Sorter.
Nice.
It actually outputs, at the end of the day, 6 unique values, which are, kind of the amplitude of these like negative going hump, middle hump, like positive going hump, and then also the time at which these happen. And from that, you can have kind of a statistical probability estimation of, is that a spike? Is it not a spike? And then based on that, you could also determine, oh, that spike looks different than that spike, must come from a different neuron.
Okay, so that's a nice signal processing step from which you can then make much better predictions about if there's a spike, especially in this kind of context where there could be multiple neurons screaming. And that also results in you being able to compress the data better.
Yeah.
And send it in. Okay. That's
and just to be clear, I mean, the labs do this, what's called spike sorting. Usually once you have these like broadband, like the fully digitized signals, and then you run a bunch of different set of algorithms to kind of tease apart. It's just all of this for us is done on the device.
On the device.
In a very low power, custom, built ASIC digital processing unit.
Highly heat constrained.
And the processing time from signal going in and giving you the output is less than a microsecond, which is, a very, very short amount of time.
Oh, yeah. So the latency has to be super short.
Correct.
Oh, wow. Oh, that's a pain in the ass.
Yeah, latency is this huge thing that you have to deal with. Right now, the biggest source of latency comes from the Bluetooth. The way in which they're packetized, and we bin them in 15 millisecond.
Oh, interesting.
Time
so
window.
It's communication constraint. Is there some potential innovation there on the protocol used?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, Bluetooth is definitely not our final wireless communication protocol that we want to get to. It's a highly
hence the N1 and the R1. I imagine that increases
NX RX.
Yeah, that's the communication protocol, because Bluetooth allows you to communicate against farther distances than you need to, so you can go much shorter.
Yeah, the primary motivation for choosing Bluetooth is that, everything has Bluetooth.
All right, so you can talk to any device.
Interoperability is just absolutely essential, especially in this early phase. And in many ways, if you can access a phone or a computer, you can do anything.
Well, it'll be interesting to step back and actually look at, again, the same pipeline that you mentioned for Nolan. So what does this whole process look like, from finding and selecting a human being to the surgery to the first time he's able to use this thing?
So we have what's called a patient registry that people can sign up to hear more about the updates. And that was a route to which Nolan applied. And the process is that once the application comes in, it contains some medical records, and we, based on their medical eligibility, there's a lot of different inclusion and exclusion criteria for them to meet. And we go through a pre-screening interview process with someone from Neuralink. And at some point, we also go out to their homes to do a BCI home audit. Because one of the most kind of revolutionary part about having this N1 system that is completely wireless is that you can use it at home. Like, you don't actually have to go to the lab, and go to the clinic to get connectorized to these like specialized equipment that you can't take home with you. So that's one of the key elements of when we're designing the system that we wanted to keep in mind. Like, people hopefully would want to be able to use this every day in the comfort of their homes. And So part of our engagement and what we're looking for during BCI home audit is to just kind of understand their situation, what other assistive technology that they use.
And we should also step back and kind of say that the estimate is 180,000 people live with quadriplegia in the United States, and each year an additional 18,000 suffer a paralyzing spinal cord injury. So these are folks who have a lot of challenges living a life in terms of accessibility, in terms of doing the things that many of us just take for granted day to day. And one of the goals of this initial study is to enable them to have sort of digital autonomy, where they by themselves can interact with a digital device using just their mind, something that you're calling telepathy. So digital telepathy, where a quadriplegic can communicate with a digital device in all the ways that we've been talking about. Control the mouse cursor enough to be able to do all kinds of stuff, including play games and tweet and all that kind of stuff. And there's a lot of people for whom the basics of life are difficult because of the things that have happened to them. So,
yeah, I mean, movement is so fundamental to our existence. I mean, even speaking involves movement of mouth, lip, larynx, and without that, it's extremely debilitating. And there are many people that we can help. And I mean, especially if you start to kind of look at other forms of movement disorders that are not just from spinal cord injury, but from ALS, MS, or even stroke that leads you, or just aging, right? That leads you to lose some of that mobility, that independence. It's extremely debilitating.
And all of these are opportunities to help people, to help alleviate suffering, to help improve the quality of life. But each of the things you mentioned is its own little puzzle that needs to have increasing levels of capability from a device like a Neuralink device. And so the first one you're focusing on is it's just a beautiful word, telepathy. So being able to communicate using your mind wirelessly with a digital device. Can you just explain this, exactly what we're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, it's exactly that. I mean, I think if you are able to control a cursor and able to click and be able to get access to computer or phone, I mean, the whole world opens up to you. And I mean, I guess the word telepathy, if you kind of think about that as just definitionally being able to transfer information from my brain to your brain without using some of the physical faculties that we have, like voices.
But the interesting thing here is, I think the thing that's not obviously clear is how exactly it works. So in order to move a cursor, there's at least a couple of ways of doing that. So one is you imagine yourself maybe moving a mouse with your hand, or you can then, which no one talked about, like imagine moving the cursor with your mind. Like but it's like there is a cognitive step here that's fascinating, because you have to use the brain, and you have to learn how to use the brain, and you kind of have to figure it out dynamically, like because you reward yourself if it works. So you there's a step that it's just a fascinating step, because you have to get the brain to start firing in the right way.
Yeah,
and you do that by imagining, like fake it till you make it. And all of a sudden it creates the right kind of signal that, if decoded correctly, can create the kind of effect. And then there's like noise around that you have to figure all of that out. But on the human side, imagine the cursor moving is what you have to do.
Yeah, he says using the force.
The force. I mean, isn't that just like fascinating to you that it works? Like, to me, it's like, holy shit, that actually works. Like, you could move a cursor with your mind.
As much as you're learning to use that thing's also learning about you. Like our model is constantly updating the weights to say, oh, if someone is thinking about, this sophisticated forms of like spiking patterns, like that actually means to do this, right?
So the machine is learning about the human, and the human is learning about the machine. So there's adaptability to the signal processing, the decoding step, and then there's the adaptation of Nolan, the human being. Like the same way, if you give me a new mouse and I move it, I learn very quickly about its sensitivity, so I'll learn to move it slower.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's other kind of signal drift and all that kind of stuff they have to adapt to.
Mm-hmm.
So both are adapting to each other.
Correct.
That's a fascinating like software challenge on both sides. The software on both, on the human software and
the organic and the inorganic.
The organic and the inorganic. Anyway, so sorry to rudely interrupt. So there's the selection that Nolan has passed with flying colors. So everything, including that it's a BCI friendly home, all of that. So what is the process of the surgery, the implantation, the first moment when he gets to use the system?
The end-to-end, we say patient in to patient out, is anywhere between 2 to 4 hours. In particular case for Nolan, it was about 3.5 hours. And there's many steps leading to, the actual robot insertion, right? So there's anesthesia, induction, and we do intra-op CT imaging to make sure that we're, drilling the hole in the right location. And this is also pre-planned beforehand. Someone like Nolan would go through fMRI, and then they can think about wiggling their hand. Obviously due to their injury, it's not going to actually lead to any sort of intended output, but it's the same part of the brain that actually lights up when you're imagining moving your finger to actually moving your finger. And that's one of the ways in which we can actually know where to place our threads, because we want to go into what's called the hand knob area in the motor cortex, and as much as possible densely put our electrode threads. So yeah, we do intra-op CT imaging to make sure and double check the location of the craniectomy. And surgeon comes in, does their thing in terms of like skin incision, craniectomy, so drilling of the skull. And then there's many different layers of the brain. There's what's called the dura, which is a very, very thick layer that surrounds the brain. That gets actually resected in a process called durectomy. And that then exposed the pia in the brain that you want to insert. And by the time it's been around anywhere between 1 to 1.5 hours, robot comes in, does this thing, placement of the target, inserting of the thread. That takes anywhere between 20 to 40 minutes. In the particular case for Nolan, it was just under or just over 30 minutes. And then after that, the surgeon comes in. There's a couple other steps of like actually inserting the dural substitute layer to protect the thread as well as the brain. And then screw in the implant, and then skin flap, and then suture, and then you're out.
So when Nolan woke up, what was that like? What was the recovery like? And when was the first time he was able to use it?
So he was actually immediately after the surgery, like an hour after the surgery, as he was waking up, we did turn on the device, make sure that we are recording neural signals. And we actually did have a couple signals that we noticed that he can actually modulate. And what I mean by modulate is that he can think about clenching his fist, and you could see the spike disappear and appear.
That's awesome.
And that was immediate, right? Immediate after in the recovery room.
How cool is that?
Yeah.
That's absolutely a human being. I mean, what did that feel like for you? This device and a human being, a first step of a gigantic journey. I mean, it's a historic moment. Even just that spike, just to be able to modulate that.
Obviously there have been other, as you mentioned, pioneers that have participated in these groundbreaking BCI, investigational early feasibility studies. So we're obviously standing in the shoulders of the giants here. We're not the first ones to actually put electrodes in a human brain. But I mean, just leading up to the surgery, there was I definitely could not sleep. It's the first time that you're working in a completely new environment. We had a lot of confidence based on our benchtop testing or preclinical R&D studies that the mechanism, the threads, the insertion, all that stuff is very safe, and that it's obviously ready for doing this in a human. But there's still a lot of unknown about, can the needle actually insert? We brought something like 40 needles just in case they break, and we ended up using only one. But I mean, that was a level of just complete unknown, right? Because it's a very, very different environment, and that's why we do clinical trial in the first place, to be able to test these things out. So extreme nervousness and many sleepless night leading up to the surgery, and definitely the day before the surgery. And it was an early morning surgery. Like we started at 7 a.m. And by the time it was around 10:30, it was everything was done. But I mean, first time seeing that, well, number one, just huge relief that this thing is doing what it's supposed to do. And two, I mean, just immense amount of gratitude for Nolan and his family, and then many others that have applied and that we've spoken to and will speak to are, true pioneers in every war. And I sort of call them the neural astronauts or neural naut.
Neural naut, yeah.
These amazing, just like in the 60s, right? Like these amazing just pioneers, right? Exploring the unknown outwards. In this case, it's inward. But an incredible amount of gratitude for them to, just participate and play a part. And it's a journey that we're embarking on together. But also, like, I think it was just that was a very, very important milestone, but our work was just starting. So a lot of just kind of anticipation for, okay, what needs to happen next? What are a set of sequences of events that needs to happen for us to, make it worthwhile for, both Nolan as well as us.
Just to linger on that, just a huge congratulations to you and the team for that milestone. I know there's a lot of work left, but that's really exciting to see. There's that's a source of hope. It's this first big step, opportunity to help hundreds of thousands of people, and then maybe expand the realm of the possible for the human mind for millions of people in the future. So it's really exciting. So like the opportunities are all ahead of us, and to do that safely and to do that effectively was really fun to see. As an engineer, just watching other engineers come together and do an epic thing, that was awesome. So huge congrats.
Thank you. It's could not have done it without the team. And that's the other thing that I told the team as well, of just this immense sense of optimism for the future. It's a very important moment for the company, needless to say, as well as hopefully for many others out there that we can help.
So speaking of challenges, Neuralink published a blog post describing that some of the threads are retracted, and so the performance as measured by bits per second dropped at first, but then eventually was regained. And that the whole story of how it was regained is super interesting. Mm-hmm. That's definitely something I'll talk to Bliss and to Nolan about. But in general, can you speak to this whole experience? How was the performance regained? And just the technical aspects of the threads being retracted and moving.
The main takeaway is that in the end, the performance have come back, and it's actually gotten better than it was before. He's actually just beat the world record yet again last week to 8.5 BPS. So, I mean, he's just cranking and he's just improving.
The previous one was that he said was 8.
Correct.
He said 8.5.
Yeah, the previous world record in human was 4.6.
Yeah.
So it's almost double. Yeah. And his goal is to try to get to 10, which is roughly around kind of the median Neuralinker using a mouse with the hand. So it's getting there.
So yes, so the performance was regained.
Yeah, better than before. So that's a story on its own of what took the BCI team to recover that performance. It was actually mostly on kind of the signal processing end. So, as I mentioned, we were kind of looking at these spike outputs from the our electrodes. And what happened is that kind of 4 weeks into the surgery, we noticed that the threads have slowly come out of the brain. And the way in which we noticed this at first, obviously, is that, I think Nolan was the first to notice that his performance was degrading. And I think at the time, we were also trying to do a bunch of different experimentation, different algorithms, different sort of UI, UX. So it was expected that there will be variability in the performance. But we did see kind of a steady decline. And then also the way in which we measure the health of the electrodes, or whether they're in the brain or not, is by measuring impedance of the electrode. So we look at kind of the interfacial, kind of the Randall circuit, they say, the capacitance and the resistance between the electrosurface and the medium. And if that changes in some dramatic ways, we have some indication. Or if you're not seeing spikes on those channels, you have some indications that something's happening there. And what we notice is that looking at those impedance plot and spike rate plots, and also because we have those electrodes recording along the depth, we were seeing some sort of movement that indicated that threads were being pulled out. And that obviously will have an implication on the model side, because if the number of inputs that are going into the model is changing because you have less of them, that model needs to get updated, right? And but there were still signals, and as I mentioned, similar to how even when you place the signals on the surface of the brain or farther away, like outside the skull, you still see some useful signals. What we started looking at is not just the spike occurrence through this BOSS algorithm that I mentioned, but we started looking at just the power of the frequency band that is interesting for Nolan to be able to modulate. So once we kind of changed the algorithm for the implant to not just give you the BOSS output, but also these spike band power output, that helped us sort of refine the model with the new set of inputs. And that was the thing that really ultimately gave us the performance back. In terms of, and obviously, like the thing that we want ultimately, and the thing that we are working towards, is figuring out ways in which we can keep those threads intact for as long as possible, so that we have many more channels going into the model. That's by far the number one priority that the team is currently embarking on, to understand how to prevent that from happening. The thing that I will say also is that, as I mentioned, this is the first time ever that we're putting these threads in a human brain. And, human brain, just for size reference, is 10 times that of the monkey brain or the sheep brain. And it's just a very, very different environment. It moves a lot more. It's like actually moved a lot more than we expected when we did Nolan surgery. And it's just a very, very different environment than what we're used to. And this is why we do clinical trial, right? We want to uncover some of these issues and failure modes earlier than later. So in many ways, it's provided us with this enormous amount of data and information to be able to solve this. And this is something that Neuralink is extremely good at. Once we have set of clear objective and engineering problem, we have enormous amount of talents across many, many disciplines to be able to come together and fix the problem very, very quickly.
But it sounds like one of the fascinating challenges here is for the system on the decoding side to be adaptable across different timescales. So whether it's movement of threads or different aspects of signal drift, sort of on the software of the human brain, something changing. Like Nolan talks about cursor drift that could be corrected, and there's a whole UX challenge to how to do that. So it sounds like adaptability is like a fundamental property that has to be engineered in.
It is, and I mean, I think, as a company, we're extremely vertically integrated. We make these thin film arrays in our own microfab.
Yeah, there's like you said, built in house. This whole paragraph here from this blog post is pretty gangster. Building the technologies described above has been no small feat. And there's a bunch of links here that I recommend people click on. We constructed in-house microfabrication capabilities to rapidly produce various iterations of thin film arrays that constitute our electrode threads. We created a custom femtosecond laser mill to manufacture components with micro-level precision. I think there's a tweet associated with this.
That's a whole thing that we can get into.
Yeah, this okay. What are we looking at here? This thing. This is so in less than 1 minute, our custom-made femtosecond laser mill cuts this geometry in the tips of our needles. So we're looking at this weirdly shaped needle. The tip is only 10 to 12 microns in width, only slightly larger than the diameter of a red blood cell. The small size allows threads to be inserted with minimal damage to the cortex. Okay, so what's interesting about this geometry? So we're looking at this just geometry of a needle.
Yeah. This is the needle that's engaging with the loops in the thread.
Mm-hmm.
So they're the ones that thread the loop, and then peel it from the silicon backing, and then this is the thing that gets inserted into the tissue, and then this pulls out, leaving the thread.
Mm-hmm.
And this kind of a notch, or the shark tooth that we used to call, is the thing that actually is grasping the loop, and then it's designed in such way such that when you pull out, leaves the loop.
And the robot is controlling this needle.
Correct. So this is actually housed in a cannula, and basically the robot has a lot of the optics that look for where the loop is. There's actually a 4 or 5 nanometer light that actually causes the polyimide to fluoresce so that you can locate the location of the loop.
So the loop lights up?
Yeah, they do. It's a micron precision process.
What's interesting about the robot that it takes to do that? That's pretty crazy. That's pretty crazy that a robot is able to get this kind of precision.
Yeah, our robot is quite heavy. Our current version of it, it's like a giant granite slab that weighs about a ton, because it needs to be sensitive to vibration, environmental vibration. And then as the head is moving at the speed that it's moving, there's a lot of kind of motion control to make sure that you can achieve that level of precision. A lot of optics that kind of zoom in on that. We're working on next generation of the robot that is lighter, easier to transport. I mean, it is a feat to move the robot.
And it's far superior to a human surgeon at this time for this particular task.
Absolutely. I mean, let alone you try to actually thread a loop in a sewing kit. This is like, we're talking like fractions of human hair. These things it's not visible.
So continuing the paragraph, we developed novel hardware and software testing systems such as our accelerated lifetime testing racks and simulated surgery environment, which is pretty cool, to stress test and validate the robustness of our technologies. We performed many rehearsals of our surgeries to refine our procedures and make them second nature. This is pretty cool. We practice surgeries on proxies with all the hardware and instruments needed in our mock or in the engineering space. This helps us rapidly test and measure. So there's like proxies.
Yeah, this proxy is super cool, actually. So there's a 3D printed skull from the images that is taken at Barrow, as well as this hydrogel mix, sort of synthetic polymer thing that actually mimics the mechanical properties of the brain. It also has vasculature of the person. Cool. So basically what we're talking about here, and there's a lot of work that has gone into making this said proxy, that it's about like finding the right concentration of these different synthetic polymers to get the right set of consistency for the needle dynamics, as they're being inserted. But we practice this surgery with the person, Nolan's basically physiology and brain, many times prior to actually doing the surgery.
So every step.
Yeah. Like, where does someone stand? Like, what you're looking at is the picture. This is in our office of this kind of corner of the robot engineering space that we, have created this like mock OR space that looks exactly like what they would experience, all the staff would experience during their actual surgery. So I mean, it's just kind of like any dance rehearsal where you know exactly where you're going to stand at what point, and you just practice that over and over and over again with an exact anatomy of someone that you're going to surgerize. And it got to a point where a lot of our engineers, when we created a craniectomy, they're like, "Oh, that looks very familiar. We've seen that before."
Yeah, man. There's wisdom you can gain through doing the same thing over and over and over. It's like Jiro Dreams of Sushi kind of thing. Because then it's like Olympic athletes visualize the Olympics, and then once you actually show up, it feels easy. It feels like any other day. It feels almost boring winning the gold medal because you visualized this so many times, you've practiced this so many times that nothing about it is new. It's boring. You win the gold medal is boring, and the experience they talk about is mostly just relief. Probably that they don't have to visualize it anymore.
Yeah, the power of the mind to visualize, and where I mean, there's a whole field that studies where muscle memory lies in cerebellum. Yeah, it's incredible.
I think this is a good place to actually ask sort of the big question that people might have is, how do we know every aspect of this that you described is safe?
At the end of the day, the gold standard is to look at the tissue. What sort of trauma did you cause the tissue, and does that correlate to whatever behavioral anomalies that you may have seen? And that's the language to which we can communicate about the safety of inserting something into the brain and what type of trauma that you can cause. So we actually have an entire department of pathology that looks at these tissue slices. There are many steps that are involved in doing this. Once you have studies that are launched to with particular endpoints in mind, at some point you have to euthanize the animal, and then you go through necropsy to kind of collect the brain tissue samples. You fix them in formalin, and you roast them, you section them, and you look at individual slices just to see what kind of reaction or lack thereof exists. So that's the kind of the language to which FDA speaks, and as well for us to kind of evaluate the safety of the insertion mechanism as well as the threads at various different time points. Both acute, so anywhere between 0 to 3 months to beyond 3 months.
So those are kind of the details of an extremely high standard of safety that has to be reached.
Correct.
FDA supervises this, but there's in general just a very high standard. And every aspect of this, including the surgery. I think Matthew McDougall has mentioned that the standard is, let's say, how to put it politely, higher than maybe some other operations that we take for granted. So the standard for all the surgical stuff here is extremely high.
Very high. I mean, it's a highly, highly regulated environment with, the governing agencies that scrutinize every medical device that gets marketed. And I think it's a good thing. It's good to have those high standards, and we try to hold extremely high standards to kind of understand what sort of damage, if any, these innovative emerging technologies and new technologies that we're building are. And so far we have been extremely impressed by lack of immune response from these threads.
Speaking of which, you talk to me with excitement about the histology and some of the images that you're able to share. Can you explain to me what we're looking at?
Yeah, so what you're looking at is a stained tissue image. So this is a sectioned tissue slice from an animal that was implanted for 7 months, so kind of a chronic time point. And you're seeing all these different colors, and each color indicates specific types of cell types. So purple and pink are astrocytes and microglia, respectively. They're types of glial cells. And yeah, the other thing that people may not be aware of is your brain is not just made up of soup of neurons and axons. There are other cells like glial cells that actually kind of is the glue and also react if there are any trauma or damage to the tissue.
But the brown are the neurons here.
The brown are the neurons and the blue is nuclei. So what you're seeing is in this kind of macro image, you're seeing these circle highlighted in white, the insertion sites. And when you zoom into one of those, you see the threads. And then in this particular case, I think we're seeing about the 16 wires that are going into the page. And the incredible thing here is the fact that you have the neurons that are these brown structures or brown circular or elliptical thing that are actually touching and abutting the threads. So what this is saying is that there's basically zero trauma that's caused during this insertion. And with these neural interfaces, these microelectrodes that you insert, that is one of the most common mode of failure. So when you insert these threads, like the Utah array, it causes neuronal death around the site because you're inserting a foreign object, right? And that kind of elicits these like immune response through microglia and astrocytes. They form this like protective layer around it. Oh, not only are you killing the neuron cells, but you're also creating this protective layer that then basically prevents you from recording neural signals because you're getting further and further away from the neurons that you're trying to record. And that is the biggest mode of failure. And in this particular example, in that inset, it's about 50 micron with that scale bar. The neurons seem to be attracted to it.
And so there's certainly no trauma. That's such a beautiful image, by the way. Just so the brown of the neurons. For some reason, I can't look away. It's really cool.
And the way that these things, like, I mean, your tissues generally don't have these beautiful colors. This is multiplex stain that uses these different proteins that are staining these at different colors. We use very standard set of staining techniques with HE, EBA1, and NUN, and GFAP. So if you go to the next image, this is also kind of illustrates the second point, because you can make an argument. And initially, when we saw the previous image, we said, "Oh, like, are the threads just floating? Like, what is happening here? Like, are we actually looking at the right thing?" So what we did is we did another stain, and this is all done in-house, of this Masson's trichrome stain, which is in blue, that shows these collagen layers. So the blue basically, like, you don't want the blue around the implant threads, because that means that there's some sort of scarring that's happened. And what you're seeing, if you look at individual threads, is that you don't see any of the blue, which means that there has been absolutely or very, very minimal, to a point where it's not detectable, amount of trauma in these inserted threads.
So that presumably is one of the big benefits of having this kind of flexible thread.
Yeah, so we think this is primarily due to the size as well as the flexibility of the threads. Also, the fact that R1 is avoiding vasculature, so we're not disrupting, or we're not causing damage to the vessels, and not breaking any of the blood-brain barrier, has basically caused the immune response to be muted.
But this is also a nice illustration of the size of things. So this is the tip of the thread.
Yeah, those are neurons. They're
neurons, and this is the thread listening, and the electrodes are positioned how?
Yeah, so this is what you're looking at is not electrode themselves. Those are the conductive wires. So each of those should probably be 2 micron in width. So what we're looking at is the coronal slice. So we're looking at some slice of the tissue. So as you go deeper, you'll obviously have less and less of the tapering of the thread. But yeah, the point basically being that there's just kind of cells around the inserted site, which is just an incredible thing to see. I've just never seen anything like this.
How easy and safe is it to remove the implant?
Yeah, so it depends on when. In the first 3 months or so after the surgery, there's a lot of kind of tissue modeling that's happening. Similar to when you get a cut. You obviously start over first couple weeks, or depending on the size of the wound, scar tissue forming, right? There are these like contracted, and then in the end they turn into scab, and you can scab it off. The same thing happens in the brain, and it's a very dynamic environment. And before the scar tissue or the neomembrane or the new membrane that forms, it's quite easy to just pull them out, and there's minimal trauma that's caused during that. Once the scar tissue forms, and with Nolan as well, we believe that that's the thing that's currently anchoring the threads. So we haven't seen any more movements since then. So they're quite stable. It gets harder to actually completely extract the threads. So our current method for removing the device is cutting the thread, leaving the tissue intact, and then unscrewing and taking the implant out. And that hole is now going to be plugged with either another Neuralink or just with the kind of a PEEK-based, plastic-based cap.
Is it okay to leave the threads in there forever?
Yeah, we think so. We've done studies where we left them there, and one of the biggest concerns that we had is like, do they migrate and do they get to a point where they should not be? We haven't seen that. Again, once the scar tissue forms, they get anchored in place. And I should also say that when we say upgrades, like we're not just talking in theory here. Like we've actually upgraded many times. Most of our monkeys or non-human primates, NHP, have been upgraded. Pager, who you saw playing Mind Pong, has the latest version of the device since 2 years ago and is seemingly very happy and healthy and fat.
So what's designed for the future, the upgrade procedure? So maybe for Nolan, what would the upgrade look like? It was essentially what you're mentioning. Is there a way to upgrade sort of the device internally, where you take it apart and sort of keep the capsule and upgrade the internals?
Yeah, so there are a couple of different things here. So for Nolan, if we were to upgrade, what we would have to do is either cut the threads or extract the threads, depending on kind of the situation there in terms of how they're anchored or scarred in. If you were to remove them with the dural substitute, you have an intact brain, so you can reinsert different threads with the updated implant package. There are a couple different other ways that we're thinking about the future of what the upgradable system looks like. One is, at the moment, we currently remove the dura, this kind of thick layer that protects the brain. But that actually is a thing that actually proliferates the scar tissue formation. So typically, the general good rule of thumb is you want to leave the nature as is and not disrupt it as much. So we're looking at ways to insert the threads through the dura, which comes with different set of challenges, such as, it's a pretty thick layer. So how do you actually penetrate that without breaking the needle? So we're looking at different needle design for that, as well as the kind of the loop engagement. The other biggest challenges are it's quite opaque optically with white light illumination. So how do you avoid still this biggest advantage that we have of avoiding vasculature? How do you image through that? How do you actually still mediate that? So there are other imaging techniques that we're looking at to enable that. But the goal, our hypothesis is that, and based on some of the early evidence that we have, doing through the dura insertion will cause minimal scarring that causes them to be much easier to extract over time. And the other thing that we're also looking at, this is going to be a fundamental change in the implant architecture, is at the moment, it's a monolithic single implant that comes with a thread that's bonded together, so you can't actually separate the thing out. But you can imagine having two-part implant. Bottom part, that is the thread that are inserted, that has the chips and maybe a radio and some power source. And then you have another implant that has more of the computational heavy load and the bigger battery. And then one can be under the dura, one can be above the dura, like, being the plug for the skull. They can talk to each other, but the thing that you want to upgrade, the computer and not the threads, if you want to upgrade that, you just go in there, remove the screws and then put in the next version, and, you're off the, it's a very, very easy surgery too. Like you do a skin incision, slip this in, screw, probably be able to do this in 10 minutes.
So that would allow you to reuse the threads, sort of.
Correct.
So, this leads to the natural question of what is the pathway to scaling the increase in the number of threads? Is that a priority? Is that like, what's the technical challenge there?
Yeah, that is a priority. So for next versions of the implant, the key metrics that we're looking to improve are number of channels, just recording from more and more neurons. We have a pathway to actually go from currently 1,000 to hopefully 3,000, if not 6,000 by end of this year. Wow. And then end of next year, we want to get to, even more, 16,000.
Wow.
There's a couple limitations to that. One is, obviously being able to photolithographically print those wires. as I mentioned, it's 2 micron in width and spacing. Obviously, there are chips that are much more advanced than those types of resolution, and we have some of the tools that we have brought in-house to be able to do that. So traces will be narrower, just so that you have to have more of the wires coming up into the chip. Chips also cannot linearly consume more energy as you have more and more channels. So there's a lot of innovations in the circuit, in architecture as well as the circuit design topology to make them lower power. You need to also think about, if you have all of these spikes, how do you send that off to the end application? So you need to think about bandwidth limitation there and potentially innovations in signal processing. Physically, one of the biggest challenges is going to be the interface. It's always the interface that breaks. Bonding this thin film array to the electronics, it starts to become very, very highly dense interconnects. So how do you connectorize that? There's a lot of innovations in kind of the 3D integrations in the recent years that we can take advantage of. One of the biggest challenges that we do have is forming this hermetic barrier, right? This is an extremely harsh environment that we're in, the brain. So how do you protect it from, like the brain trying to kill your electronics to also your electronics leaking things that you don't want into the brain, and that forming that hermetic barrier is going to be a very, very big challenge that we, I think are actually well suited to tackle.
How do you test that? Like, what's the development environment?
Yeah,
to simulate that kind of harshness.
Yeah, so this is where the accelerated life tester essentially is a brain in a vat. Mm-hmm. It literally is a vessel that is made up of, and again, for all intents and purpose for this particular types of tests, your brain is a salt water, mm-hmm. and you can also put some other set of chemicals like reactive oxygen species that get at kind of these interfaces and trying to cause a reaction to pull it apart. But you could also increase the rate at which these interfaces are aging by just increasing temperature. So every 10 degrees Celsius that you increase, you're basically accelerating time by 2x. And there's limit as to how much temperature you want to increase, because at some point there's some other nonlinear dynamics that causes you to have other nasty gases to form that just is not realistic in an environment. So what we do is we increase in our ALT chamber by 20 degrees Celsius, that increases the aging by four times. So essentially 1 day in ALT chamber is 4 day in calendar year. Mm-hmm. And we look at whether the implants still are intact, mm-hmm. Including the threads and
operation and all of that.
It obviously is not an exact same environment as a brain, because brain has mechanical, other more biological goops that attack at it. But it is a good testing environment for at least the enclosure and the strength of the enclosure. And I mean, we've had implants, the current version of the implant that has been in there for, close to 2.5 years, which is equivalent to a decade, and they seem to be fine.
So it's interesting that the brain, so basically close approximation is warm salt water. Hot salt water is a good testing environment.
Yeah.
By the way, I'm drinking Element, which is basically salt water, which is making me kind of, it doesn't have computational power the way the brain does, but maybe in terms of other characteristics, it's quite similar. Yeah. And I'm consuming it.
You have to get it in the right pH too.
And then consciousness will emerge.
Yeah.
No. All right.
But by the way, the other thing that also is interesting about our enclosure is, if you look at our implant, it's not your common looking medical implant that usually is encased in a titanium can that's laser welded. We use this polymer called PCTFE, polychlorotrifluoroethylene, which is actually commonly used in blister packs. So when you have a pill and you're trying to pop the pill, there's like kind of that plastic membrane. That's what this is. No one's actually ever used this except us. And the reason we wanted to do this is because it's electromagnetically transparent. So when we talked about the electromagnetic inductive charging with titanium can, usually if you want to do something like that, you have to have a sapphire window, and it's a very, very tough process to scale.
So you're doing a lot of iteration here in every aspect of this: the materials, the software, the hard, all
the whole shebang.
So you mentioned scaling. Is it possible to have multiple Neuralink devices as one of the ways of scaling? To have multiple Neuralink devices implanted?
That's the goal. Yeah, we've had. I mean, our monkeys have had 2 Neuralinks, one in each hemisphere, and then we're also looking at potential of having one in motor cortex, one in visual cortex, and one in wherever other cortex.
So focusing on a particular function, one Neuralink device.
Correct.
I mean, I wonder if there's some level of customization that can be done on the compute side. So for the motor cortex,
absolutely. That's the goal. And we talk about at Neuralink building a generalized neural interface to the brain. And that also is strategically how we're approaching this with marketing and also with regulatory, which is, hey, look, we have the robot, and the robot can access any part of the cortex. Right now, we're focused on motor cortex with current version of the N1 that's specialized for motor decoding tasks. But also at the end of the day, there's kind of a general compute available there. But typically, if you want to really get down to kind of hyper optimizing for power and efficiency, you do need to get to some specialized function, right? But what we're saying is that, hey, you are now used to this robotic insertion techniques, which took many years of showing data and conversation with the FDA, and also internally convincing ourselves that this is safe. And now the difference is that if we go to other parts of the brain, like visual cortex, which we're interested in as our second product, obviously it's a completely different environment. The cortex is laid out very, very differently. It's going to be more stimulation focused rather than recording, just kind of creating visual percepts. But in the end, we're using the same thin film array technology. We're using the same robot insertion technology. We're using the same, packaging technology. Now it's more the conversation is focused around what are the differences and what are the implications of those differences in safety and efficacy.
The way you said second product is both hilarious and awesome to me. That product being restoring sight for blind people. So can you speak to stimulating the visual cortex? I mean, the possibilities there are just incredible to be able to give that gift back to people who don't have sight or even any aspect of that. Can you just speak to the challenges of, there's several challenges here.
Oh, many.
One of which is, like you said, from recording to the stimulation. Just any aspect of that you're both excited and see the challenges of.
Yeah, I guess I'll start by saying that we actually have been capable of stimulating through our thin film array as well as our electronics for years. We have actually demonstrated some of that capabilities for reanimating the limb in the spinal cord. Obviously for the current EFS study, we've hardware disabled that, so that's something that we wanted to embark as a separate journey. And obviously there are many different ways to write information into the brain. The way in which we're doing that is through electrical, passing electrical current and kind of causing that to really change the local environment so that you can sort of artificially cause kind of the neurons to depolarize in nearby areas. For vision specifically, the way our visual system works, it's both well understood. I mean, anything with kind of brain, there are aspects of it that's well understood, but in the end, like we don't really know anything. But the way visual system works is that you have photon hitting your eye, and in your eyes, there are these specialized cells called photoreceptor cells that convert the photon energy into electrical signals, and then that then gets projected to your back of your head, your visual cortex. It goes through actually thalamic system called LGN that then projects it out. And then in the visual cortex, there's, visual area 1 or V1, and then there's a bunch of other higher level processing layers like V2, V3. And there are actually kind of interesting parallels. And when you study the behaviors of these convolutional neural networks, like what the different layers of the network is detecting, first they're detecting like these edges, and they're then detecting some more natural curves, and then they start to detect like objects, right? Kind of similar thing happens in the brain. And a lot of that has been inspired, and also, it's been kind of exciting to see some of the correlations there. But things like from there, where does cognition arise, and where's color encoded? There's just not a lot of fundamental understanding there. So in terms of kind of bringing sight back to those that are blind, there are many different forms of blindness. There's actually 1 million people in the US that are legally blind. That means like certain like score below in kind of the visual test. I think it's something like if you can see something at 20 feet distance that normal people can see at 200 feet distance, like if you're worse than that, you're legally blind.
So fundamentally, that means you can't function effectively.
Correct.
Using sight in the world.
Yeah, like to navigate your environment. And yeah, there are different forms of blindness. There are forms of blindness where there's some degeneration of your retina, these photoreceptor cells, and rest of your visual processing that I described is intact. And for those types of individuals, you may not need to maybe stick electrodes into the visual cortex. You can actually build retinal prosthetic devices that actually just replaces the function of that retinal cells that are degenerated. And there are many companies that are working on that. But that's a very small slice, albeit significant, still smaller slice of folks that are legally blind. If there's any damage along that circuitry, whether it's in the optic nerve or just the LGN circuitry or any break in that circuit, that's not going to work for you. And the source of where you need to actually cause that visual percept to happen, because your biological mechanism is not doing that, is by placing electrodes in the visual cortex in the back of your head. And the way in which this would work is that you would have an external camera, whether it's something as unsophisticated as a GoPro, or some sort of wearable Ray-Ban type glasses that Meta's working on, that captures a scene, right? And that scene is then converted to a set of electrical impulses or stimulation pulses that you would activate in your visual cortex through these thin film arrays. And by playing some concerted kind of orchestra of these stimulation patterns, you can create what's called phosphenes, which are these kind of white yellowish dots that you can also create by just pressing your eyes. You can actually create those percepts by stimulating the visual cortex. And the name of the game is really have many of those and have those percepts the phosphenes be as small as possible, so that you can start to tell apart, like they're the individual pixels of the screen, right? So if you have many of those, potentially you'll be able to, in the long term, be able to actually get naturalistic vision. But in the like short term to maybe midterm, being able to at least be able to have object detection algorithms run on your glasses, the pre-processing units, and then being able to at least see the edges of things so you don't bump into stuff.
This is incredible. This is really incredible. So you basically would be adding pixels, and your brain would start to figure out what those pixels mean.
Yeah.
And like with different kinds of assistant on the signal processing on all fronts.
Yeah. The thing that actually, so a couple things. One is, obviously if you're blind from birth, the way brain works, especially in the early age, neuroplasticity is really nothing other than, kind of your brain and different parts of your brain fighting for the limited territory.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, very, very quickly you see cases where, people that are, I mean, you also hear about people who are blind that have heightened sense of hearing or some other senses. And the reason for that is because that cortex that's not used just gets taken over by these different parts of the cortex. So for those types of individuals, I mean, I guess they're going to have to now map some other parts of their senses into what they call vision, but it's going to be obviously a very, very different conscious experience. So I think that's an interesting caveat. The other thing that also is important to highlight is that we're currently limited by our biology in terms of the wavelength that we can see. There's a very, very small wavelength that is a visible light wavelength that we can see with our eyes. But when you have an external camera with this BCI system, you're not limited to that. You can have infrared, you can have UV, you can have whatever other spectrum that you want to see. And whether that gets mapped to some sort of weird conscious experience, I have no idea. But when oftentimes I talk to people about the goal of Neuralink being going beyond the limits of our biology. That's sort of what I mean.
And if you're able to control the kind of raw signal, is that when we use our sight, we're getting the photons and there's not much processing on it. If you're be able to control that signal, maybe you can do some kind of processing. Maybe you do object detection ahead of time.
Yeah.
You're doing some kind of pre-processing, and there's a lot of possibilities to explore that. So it's not just increasing sort of thermal imaging, that kind of stuff, but it's also just doing some kind of interesting processing.
Correct. Yeah. I mean, my theory of how like visual system works also is that, I mean, there's just so many things happening in the world, and there's a lot of photons that are going into your eye, and it's unclear exactly where some of the pre-processing steps are happening. But I mean, I actually think that just from a fundamental perspective, there's just so much, the reality that we're in, if it's a reality, is so, there's so much data, and I think humans are just unable to actually like eat enough actually to process all that information. So there's some sort of filtering that does happen, whether that happens in the retina, whether that happens in different layers of the visual cortex, unclear. But like the analogy that I sometimes think about is, you know, if your brain is a CCD camera and all of the information in the world is a sun, and when you try to actually look at the sun with the CCD camera, it's just going to saturate the sensors, right? Because it's an enormous amount of energy. So what you do is you end up adding these filters, right, to just kind of narrow the information that's coming to you and being captured. And I think, you know, things like our experiences or our, you know, like drugs like propofol, that like anesthetic drug, or, you know, psychedelics, what they're doing is they're kind of swapping out these filters and putting in new ones or removing older ones and kind of controlling our conscious experience.
Yeah, man, not to distract from the topic, but I just took a very high dose of ayahuasca in the Amazon jungle. So yes, it's a nice way to think about it. You're swapping out different experiences, and with Neuralink being able to control that, primarily at first to improve function, not for entertainment purposes or enjoyment purposes, but
yeah, giving back lost functions.
Giving back lost functions, and that's especially when the function is completely lost. Anything is a huge help. Would you implant a Neuralink device in your own brain?
Absolutely. I mean, maybe not right now, but absolutely.
What kind of capability, once reached, you would start getting real curious and almost get a little antsy, like jealous of people that get as you watch them get implanted?
Yeah, I mean, I think, even with our early participants, if they start to do things that I can't do, which I think is in the realm of possibility for them to be able to get, 15, 20, if not like 100 BPS, right? There's nothing that fundamentally stops us from being able to achieve that type of performance. I would certainly get jealous that they can do that.
I should say that watching Nolan, I get a little jealous because he's having so much fun, and it seems like such a chill way to play video games.
Yeah.
So
the thing that also is hard to appreciate sometimes is that, he's doing these things while talking, and it's multitasking, right? So it's clearly, it's obviously cognitively intensive, but similar to how, when we talk, we move our hands, like these things, like, you like are multitasking. I mean, he's able to do that. And, you won't be able to do that with other assistive technology as far as I'm aware. If you're obviously using like an eye tracking device, you're very much fixated on that thing that you're trying to do. And if you're using voice control, I mean, like if you say some other stuff, you don't get to use that.
Yeah, the multitasking aspect of that is really interesting. So it's not just the BPS for the primary task; it's the parallelization of multiple tasks. If you measure the BPS for the entirety of the human organism, so if you're talking and doing a thing with your mind and looking around, also. I mean, there's just a lot of parallelization that can be happening.
But I mean, I think at some point for him, like if he wants to really achieve those high level BPS, it does require like full attention, right? And that's a separate circuitry that is a big mystery, like how attention works, and
attention, like cognitive load. I've read a lot of literature on people doing two tasks, like. You have your primary task and a secondary task, and the secondary task is a source of distraction. And how does that affect the performance of the primary task? And there's, depending on the task, there's a lot of interesting. I mean, this is an interesting computational device, right? And I think there's,
to say the least,
a lot of novel insights that can be gained from everything. I mean, I personally am surprised that no one's able to do such incredible control of the cursor while talking. And also being nervous at the same time, because he's talking like all of us are. If you're talking in front of the camera, you get nervous. So all of those are coming into play, and he's able to still achieve high performance. Surprising. I mean, all of this is really amazing. And I think just after researching this really in depth, I kind of want a Neuralink.
Get in the line.
And also the safety, get in line. Well, we should say the registry is for people who have quadriplegia and all that kind of stuff. So there'll be a separate line for people. They're just curious, like myself. So now that Nolan, patient P1, is part of the ongoing PRIME study, what's the high-level vision for P2, P3, P4, P5, and just the expansion into other human beings that are getting to experience this implant?
Yeah, I mean, the primary goal is, for our study in the first place, is to achieve safety endpoints, just understand safety of this device as well as the implantation process. And also at the same time, understand the efficacy and the impact that it could have on the potential users' lives. And just because you have, and you're living with tetraplegia, it doesn't mean your situation is same as another person living with tetraplegia. It's wildly varying. And it's something that we're hoping to also understand how our technology can serve not just a very small slice of those individuals, but broader group of individuals, and being able to get the feedback to just really build the best product for them. So our there's obviously also goals that we have, and the primary purpose of the early feasibility study is to learn from each and every participant to improve the device, improve the surgery before we embark on what's called a pivotal study that then is a much larger trial that starts to look at statistical significance of your endpoints. And that's required before you can then market the device. And that's how it works in the US and just generally around the world. That's the process you follow. So, our goal is to really just understand from people like Nolan, P2, P3, future participants, what aspects of our device needs to improve. If it turns out that people are like, I really don't like the fact that it lasts only 6 hours. I want to be able to use this computer for, like 24 hours. I mean, that is a, user needs and user requirements, which we can only find out from just being able to engage with them.
So before the pivotal study, there's kind of like a rapid innovation based on individual experiences. You're learning from individual people, how they use it, like the high resolution details in terms of like cursor control and signal and all that kind of stuff to like life experience.
Yeah. So there's hardware changes, but also just firmware updates. So even when we had that sort of recovery event for Nolan, he now has the new firmware that he has been updated with, and it's similar to how like your phones get updated all the time with new firmwares for security patches, whatever new functionality, UI, right? And that's something that is possible with our implant. It's not a static one-time device that can only do the thing that it said it can do. I mean, similar to Tesla, you can do over-the-air firmware updates, and now you have completely new user interface and all this bells and whistles and improvements on everything, like the latest, right? That's when we say generalized platform, that's what we're talking about.
Yeah, it's really cool how the app that Nolan is using, there's like calibration, all that kind of stuff, and then there's update. you just click and get an update. What other future capabilities are you kind of looking to? You said vision. That's a fascinating one. Mm-hmm. What about sort of accelerated typing or speech or this kind of stuff? What else is there?
Those are still in the realm of movement program. So largely speaking, we have two programs. We have the movement program and we have the vision program. The movement program, currently is focused around the digital freedom. As you can easily guess, if you can control 2D cursor in the digital space, you could move anything in the physical space. So robotic arms, wheelchair, your environment, or even really like whether it's through the phone or just like directly to those interfaces. So like to those machines. So we're looking at ways to kind of expand those types of capability, even for Nolan. That requires conversation with the FDA and kind of showing safety data for if there's a robotic arm or a wheelchair that, we can guarantee that they're not going to hurt themselves accidentally, right? It's very different if you're moving stuff in the digital domain versus like in the physical space. You can actually potentially cause harm to the participants. So we're working through that right now. Speech does involve different areas of the brain. Speech prosthetic is very, very fascinating. And there's actually been a lot of really amazing work that's been happening in academia. Sergei Stavitsky at UC Davis, Jamie Henderson, and late Krishna Shenoy at Stanford are doing just some incredible amount of work in improving speech neuroprosthetics, and those are actually looking more at parts of the motor cortex that are controlling these vocal articulators, and being able to like even by mouthing the word or imagine speech, you can pick up those signals. The more sophisticated, higher level processing areas like the Broca's area or Wernicke's area, those are still very, very big mystery in terms of the underlying mechanism of how all that stuff works. But I think Neuralink's eventual goal is to kind of understand those things and be able to provide a platform and tools to be able to understand that and study that.
This is where I get to the pothead questions. Do you think we can start getting insight into things like thought? So speech is, there's a muscular component, like you said. There's like the act of producing sounds. But then what about the internal things like cognition? Like low-level thoughts and high-level thoughts. Do you think we'll start noticing kind of signals that could be picked up, that could they could be understood, that could be maybe used in order to interact with the outside world?
In some ways, like I guess this starts to kind of get into the hard problem of consciousness. Mm-hmm. I mean, on one hand, all of these are at some point set of electrical signals that from there, maybe it in itself is giving you the cognition or the meaning, or somehow human mind is an incredibly amazing storytelling machine. So we're telling ourselves and fooling ourselves that there's some interesting meaning here. But I certainly think that BCI and really BCI at the end of the day is a set of tools that help you kind of study the underlying mechanisms in a both like local but also broader sense. And whether, there's some interesting patterns of like electrical signal that means like you're thinking this versus, and you can either like learn from like many sets of data to correlate some of that and be able to do mind reading or not. I'm not sure. I certainly would not kind of rule that out as a possibility, but I think BCI alone probably can't do that. There's probably additional set of tools and framework, and also like just hard problem of consciousness at the end of the day is rooted in this philosophical question of like what is the meaning of it all? What's the nature of our existence? Like where does the mind emerge from this complex network? Like,
yeah, how does the subjective experience emerge from just a bunch of spikes, electrical spikes?
Yeah. I mean, we do really think about BCI and what we're building as a tool for understanding the mind, the brain, the only question that matters. There's actually there actually is some biological existence proof of like what it would take to kind of start to form some of these experiences that may be unique. If you actually look at every one of our brains, there are two hemispheres. There's a left-sided brain, there's a right-sided brain. And I mean, unless you have some other conditions, you normally don't feel like left legs or right legs. Like you just feel like one legs, right? So what is happening there, right? If you actually look at the two hemispheres, there's a structure that kind of connectorizes the two called the corpus callosum that is supposed to have around 200 to 300 million connections or axons. So whether that means that's the number of interface and electrodes that we need to create some sort of mind meld, or from that, like whatever new conscious experience that you can experience. But yeah, I do think that there's like kind of an interesting existence proof that we all have.
And that threshold is unknown at this time.
Oh yeah, these things, everything in this domain is speculation, right?
And then there will be you'd be continuously pleasantly surprised. Do you see a world where there's millions of people, like tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people walking around with a Neuralink device or multiple Neuralink devices in their brain?
I do. First of all, there are, like if you look at worldwide, people suffering from movement disorders and visual deficits. I mean that's in the tens, if not hundreds of millions of people. So that alone, I think there's a lot of benefit and potential good that we can do with this type of technology. And when you start to get into kind of like psychiatric application, depression, anxiety, hunger, or obesity, right? Like mood control of appetite. I mean, that starts to become very real to everyone.
Not to mention that most people on Earth have a smartphone. And once BCI starts competing with a smartphone as a preferred methodology of interacting with the digital world, that also becomes an interesting thing.
Oh yeah, I mean this is even before going to that, right? I mean, there's like the entire world that could benefit from these types of things. And then like if we're talking about kind of next generation of how we interface with machines or even ourselves, in many ways I think BCI can play a role in that. And some of the things that I also talk about is I do think that there is a real possibility that you could see 8 billion people walking around with Neuralink.
Well, thank you so much for pushing ahead, and I look forward to that exciting future.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to this conversation with DJ Sa. And now, dear friends, here's Matthew McDougall, the head neurosurgeon at Neuralink. When did you first become fascinated with the human brain?
Since forever. As far back as I can remember, I've been interested in the human brain. I mean, I was, a thoughtful kid and a bit of an outsider. And you sit there thinking about what the most important things in the world are in your little tiny adolescent brain. And the answer that I came to, that I converged on, was that all of the things you can possibly conceive of as things that are important for human beings to care about are literally contained, in the skull. Both the perception of them and their relative values, and the solutions to all our problems, and all of our problems are all contained in the skull. And if we knew more about how that worked, how the brain encodes information and generates desires and generates agony and suffering, we could do more about it. You think about all the really great triumphs in human history. You think about all the really horrific tragedies. You think about the Holocaust. You think about any prison full of human stories, and all of those problems boil down to neurochemistry. So if you get a little bit of control over that, you provide people the option to do better. In the way I read history, the way people have dealt with having better tools is that they most often, in the end, do better, with huge asterisks. But I think it's an interesting, a worthy, and noble pursuit to give people more options, more tools.
Yeah, that's a fascinating way to look at human history. You just imagine all these neurobiological mechanisms, Stalin, Hitler, all of these, Genghis Khan, all of them just had like a brain. It just a bunch of neurons, like a few tens of billions of neurons, gaining a bunch of information over a period of time. They have a set of module that does language and memory and all that. And from there, in the case of those people, they're able to murder millions of people.
Yeah.
And all that coming from, there's not some glorified notion of a dictator of this enormous mind or something like this. It's just the brain.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, a lot of that has to do with how well people like that can organize those around them.
Other brains.
Yeah. And so I always find it interesting to look to primatology, look to our closest non-human relatives for clues as to how humans are going to behave and what particular humans are able to achieve. And so you look at chimpanzees and bonobos, and they're similar but different in their social structures, particularly. And I went to Emory in Atlanta and studied under Franz de Waal, the great Franz de Waal, who was kind of the leading primatologist, who recently died. And his work at looking at chimps through the lens of, how you would watch an episode of Friends and understand the motivations of the characters interacting with each other. He would look at a chimp colony and basically apply that lens. I'm massively oversimplifying it. If you do that, instead of just saying, subject 473, through his feces, it's subject 471, you talk about them in terms of their human struggles, accord them the dignity of themselves as actors with understandable goals and drives, what they want out of life. And primarily it's, the things we want out of life: food, sex, companionship, power. You can understand chimp and bonobo behavior in the same lights much more easily. And I think doing so gives you the tools you need to reduce human behavior from the kind of false complexity that we layer onto it with language, and look at it in terms of, these humans are looking for companionship, sex, food, power. And I think that's a pretty powerful tool to have in understanding human behavior.
And I just went to the Amazon jungle for a few weeks, and it's a very visceral reminder that a lot of life on Earth is just trying to get laid.
Yeah.
They're all screaming at each other.
Yeah.
Like, I saw a lot of monkeys, and they're just trying to impress each other. Or maybe there's a battle for power, but a lot of the battle for power has to do with them getting laid.
Right. Breeding rights often go with alpha status. And so if you can get a piece of that, then you're going to do okay.
And would like to think that we're somehow fundamentally different, but especially when it comes to primates, we really aren't, we can use fancier poetic language, but maybe some of the underlying drives that motivate us are similar.
Yeah, I think that's true.
And all of that is coming from the brain.
Yeah.
So when did you first start studying the brain as a biological mechanism?
Basically, the moment I got to college, I started looking around for labs that I could do neuroscience work in. I originally approached that from the angle of looking at interactions between the brain and the immune system, which isn't the most obvious place to start. But I had this idea at the time that the contents of your thoughts would have an impact, a direct impact, maybe a powerful one, on non-conscious systems in your body, the systems we think of as, homeostatic, automatic mechanisms like fighting off a virus, like repairing a wound. And sure enough, there are big crossovers between the two. I mean, it gets to kind of a key point that I think goes under-recognized. One of the things people don't recognize or appreciate about the human brain enough, and that is that it basically controls or has a huge role in almost everything that your body does. Like you try to name an example of something in your body that isn't directly controlled or massively influenced by the brain, and it's pretty hard. I mean, you might say like bone healing or something, but even those systems, the hypothalamus and pituitary, end up playing a role in coordinating the endocrine system that does have a direct influence on, say, the calcium level in your blood that goes to bone healing. So non-obvious connections between those things implicate the brain as really a potent prime mover in all of health.
One of the things I realized in the other direction too, how most of the systems in the body are integrated with the human brain, like they affect the brain also, like the immune system. I think there's just, people who study Alzheimer's and those kinds of things. It's just surprising how much you can understand of that from the immune system, from the other systems that don't obviously seem to have anything to do with sort of the nervous system. They all play together.
Yeah, you could understand how that would be driven by evolution too, just in some simple examples. If you get sick, if you get a communicable disease, you get the flu, it's pretty advantageous for your immune system to tell your brain, hey, now be antisocial for a few days. Don't go be the life of the party tonight. In fact, maybe just cuddle up somewhere warm under a blanket and just stay there for a day or two. And sure enough, that tends to be the behavior that you see both in animals and in humans. If you get sick, elevated levels of interleukins in your blood and TNF-alpha in your blood ask the brain to cut back on social activity and even moving around. You have lower locomotor activity in animals that are infected with viruses.
So from there, the early days in neuroscience to surgery, when did that step happen?
Yeah.
Which is a leap.
It was sort of an evolution of thought. I wanted to study the brain. I started studying the brain in undergrad in this neuroimmunology lab. I, from there, realized at some point that I didn't want to just generate knowledge. I wanted to affect real changes in the actual world, in actual people's lives. And so after having not really thought about going into medical school, I was on a track to go into a PhD program. I said, well, I'd like that option. I'd like to actually potentially help tangible people in front of me. And doing a little digging, found that there exists these MD, PhD programs or you can choose not to choose between them and do both. And so I went to USC for medical school and had a joint PhD program with Caltech, where I met, actually chose that program particularly because of a researcher at Caltech named Richard Anderson, who's one of the godfathers of primate neuroscience. It has a macaque lab where Utah arrays and other electrodes were being inserted into the brains of monkeys to try to understand how intentions were being encoded in the brain. So, I ended up there with the idea that maybe I would be a neurologist and study the brain on the side, and then discovered that neurology, again, I'm going to make enemies by saying this, but
Yeah.
neurology predominantly and distressingly to me is the practice of diagnosing a thing and then saying good luck with that when there's not much we can do. And neurosurgery, very differently, it's a powerful lever on taking people that are headed in a bad direction and changing their course, in the sense of brain tumors that are potentially treatable or curable with surgery. Even aneurysms in the brain, blood vessels that are going to rupture, you can save lives, really, is at the end of the day what mattered to me. And so I was at USC, as I mentioned. That happens to be one of the great neurosurgery programs. And so I met these truly epic neurosurgeons, Alex Kalesi and Micah Puzzo and Steve Giannotta and Marty Weiss, these sort of epic people that were just human beings in front of me. And so it kind of changed my thinking from neurosurgeons are distant gods that live on another planet and occasionally come and visit us, to these are humans that have problems and are people, and there's nothing fundamentally preventing me from being one of them. And so at the last minute in medical school, I changed gears from going into a different specialty and switched into neurosurgery, which cost me a year. I had to do another year of research because I was so far along in the process that to switch into neurosurgery, the deadlines had already passed. So it was a decision that cost time, but absolutely worth it.
What was the hardest part of the training on the neurosurgeon track?
Yeah, two things. I think that, residency in neurosurgery is sort of a competition of pain, of like how much pain can you eat and smile.
Yeah.
And so there's work hour restrictions that are not really, they're viewed at, I think, internally among the residents as weakness. Mm-hmm. And so most neurosurgery residents try to work as hard as they can. And that, I think, necessarily means working long hours and sometimes over the work hour limits. And, we care about being compliant with whatever regulations are in front of us. But I think more important than that, people want to give their all in becoming a better neurosurgeon because the stakes are so high. And so it's a real fight to get residents to, say, go home at the end of their shift and not stay and do more surgery.
Are you seriously saying like one of the hardest things is literally like forcing them to get sleep and rest and all this kind of stuff?
Historically, that was the case. I think the next generation, I think the next generation is more compliant and more self-care.
Weaker is what you mean. All right, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding.
I didn't say it.
Now I'm making enemies. No, okay, I get it. Wow, that's fascinating.
Yeah.
So what was the second thing?
The personalities, and maybe the two are connected. But
so was it pretty competitive?
It's competitive, and it's also, as we touched on earlier, primates like power, and I think neurosurgery has long had this aura of mystique and excellence and whatever about it. And so it's an invitation, I think, for people that are cloaked in that authority. A board certified neurosurgeon is basically a walking fallacious appeal to authority, right? You have license to walk into any room and act like you're, an expert on whatever. And fighting that tendency is not something that most neurosurgeons do well. Humility isn't the forte.
Yeah, I have friends who know you, and whenever they speak about you, that yours have the surprising quality for a neurosurgeon of humility, which I think indicates that it's not as common as perhaps in other professions, because there is a kind of gigantic, sort of heroic aspect to neurosurgery, and I think it gets to people's head a little bit.
Yeah. Well, I think that that allows me to play well at an Elon company.
Yes.
Because Elon, one of his strengths, I think, is to just instantly see through fallacy from authority.
Yeah.
So nobody walks into a room that he's in and says, well, God damn it, you have to trust me. I'm the guy that built the last, 10 rockets or something. And he says, well, you did it wrong and we can do it better. Or I'm the guy that, kept Ford alive for the last 50 years. You listen to me on how to build cars. And he says, no. And so you don't walk into a room that he's in and say, well, I'm a neurosurgeon. Let me tell you how to do it. He's going to say, well, I'm a human being that has a brain. I can think from first principles myself. Thank you very much. And here's how I think it ought to be done. Let's go try it and see who's right. And that's, proven, I think, over and over in his case to be a very powerful approach.
If we just take that tangent, there's a fascinating interdisciplinary team at Neuralink that you get to interact with, including Elon. What do you think is the secret to a successful team? What have you learned from just getting to observe these folks?
Yeah.
World experts in different disciplines work together.
Yeah, there's a sweet spot where people disagree and forcefully speak their mind and passionately defend their position, and yet are still able to accept information from others and change their ideas when they're wrong. And so I like the analogy of sort of how you polish rocks. You put hard things in a hard container and spin it. People bash against each other, and out comes a more refined product. And so to make a good team at Neuralink, we've tried to find people that are not afraid to defend their ideas passionately, and occasionally strongly disagree with people that they're working with, and have the best idea come out on top. It's not an easy balance. Again, to refer back to the primate brain, it's not something that is inherently built into the primate brain to say, I passionately put all my chips on this position and now I'm just going to walk away from it and admit you were right. Mm-hmm. Part of our brains tell us that is a power loss, that is a loss of face, a loss of standing in the community, and now you're a Zeta chump because your idea got trounced. And you just have to, recognize that little voice in the back of your head is maladaptive and it's not helping the team win.
Yeah, you have to have the confidence to be able to walk away from an idea that you hold on to. Yeah. And if you do that often enough, you're actually going to become the best in the world at your thing. I mean, that rapid iteration.
Yeah, you'll at least be a member of a winning team.
Ride the wave. What did you learn? You mentioned there's a lot of amazing neurosurgeons at USC. What lessons about surgery and life have you learned from those folks?
Yeah, I think working your ass off, working hard while functioning as a member of a team, getting a job done that is incredibly difficult. Working incredibly long hours, being up all night, taking care of someone that you think probably won't survive no matter what you do. Working hard to make people that you passionately dislike look good the next morning. These folks were relentless in their pursuit of excellent neurosurgical technique, decade over decade, and I think we're well recognized for that excellence. So it's especially Marty Weiss, Steve Giannotta, Micah Puzzo, they made huge contributions not only to surgical technique, but they built training programs that trained dozens or hundreds of amazing neurosurgeons. I was just lucky to kind of be in their wake.
What's that like? You mentioned doing a surgery where the person is likely not to survive. Does that wear on you?
Yeah. It's especially challenging when you, with all respect to our elders, it doesn't hit so much when you're taking care of an 80-year-old and something was going to get them pretty soon anyway. And so you lose a patient like that, and it was part of the natural course of what is expected of them in the coming years, regardless. Taking care of, a father of 2 or 3, 4 young kids, someone in their 30s that didn't have it coming, and they show up in your ER having their first seizure of their life, and lo and behold, they've got a huge malignant, inoperable, or incurable brain tumor. You can only do that, I think, a handful of times before it really starts eating away at your armor, or